like that, and it's not apartheid, and how can you make such comparisons? Now, does everyone even know what apartheid is, or what it refers to, and why it would be so offensive? Well, for those who, unlike me, aren't old enough to remember, apartheid was the system of racial segregation that existed in South Africa until 1994. In South Africa, you had a white minority of about, at the time, 5 million people, ruling over a black indigenous majority who were almost 9 or 10 times as many as whites. And you had a system of government where it was a democracy for white people. White people could vote, white people were guaranteed basic civil rights, white people were guaranteed jobs and benefits, they had better pay for the same kind of work. The best land was reserved for white people. Whole areas of cities were reserved for white people, and there were violent expulsions of Africans to make way for white people from many parts of the city, of the major cities. And of course, the struggle against apartheid is something that became an international cause, especially in the 1980s, when boycotting South African goods, when major artists refused to play in South Africa, when sports teams refused to go to South Africa and South African teams were not received in other countries. Eventually there were diplomatic sanctions and economic sanctions against South Africa, very, very late. Now the thing you have to remember is that apartheid had existed in South Africa in a formal sense for decades, although racism and colonialism went back hundreds of years. But it took until the 1980s for what we call the international community to isolate the apartheid regime and to act. And our South African friends tell us that international solidarity, particularly boycott, divestment, and sanctions, played a very important role in bolstering the indigenous struggle against apartheid and eventually bringing down the apartheid regime in 1994 and replacing it with a one-person, one-vote system. So there are all sorts of references to apartheid which take us back to that time, but do they even apply to Israel? And can we talk about apartheid and ending apartheid as a paradigm? And that's what I would like to talk about. Of course, anytime you compare two situations, there are differences, and nobody can deny that. The point isn't to say that Israel and apartheid South Africa were the same, exactly the same. They weren't. And by the way, when you say apartheid, we don't just refer to a strict comparison between Israel and South Africa, but there is a definition of apartheid in international law that was passed by the United Nations. Now, many of you will recognize this shape. It is the I'm pretty good at drawing this map, aren't I? It is the shape of historic Palestine on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Mediterranean Sea. And this is Jordan. This is Syria. Lebanon and Egypt. And so what do we know about the area in between? What some people call Palestine and others might call Eretz Israel or the land of Israel. The name, of course, is contested because everything about it is contested. But in this area, you have how many people living roughly? Does anyone know?
12 million?
About 12 million, correct. And roughly half of them are Israeli Jews, and the other half are Palestinians, and there's about just under 1 million who are neither Israeli Jews nor Palestinians. But among Israeli Jews and Palestinians, it's about 50-50. But they don't all live under the same political conditions and a regime. So let's talk quickly about how and where they live. So I'm not going to go into all the history now, but you're welcome to ask me about it afterwards. But just in a sentence or two, in 1948, Israel was created on this area, which is 78% of historic Palestine. And one of the taboo subjects for many, many years, still a taboo in many places, is how Israel came to be. And in Israeli mythology or historiography, it was a great miracle, or it was done by the United Nations, or the Palestinians just upped and left. There's a whole sort of set of narratives around it which are designed to obscure what actually happened, and which is now not contested by any serious historians, including Israeli Zionist historians at this point. And that is the deliberate expulsion of the majority of the settled Palestinian population from what became Israel. And they're becoming refugees in what came to be known as the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, and points beyond. So Israel came into being through violence. Some of these sort of justifications and excuses that are often used are, well, Israel was attacked by Arab states who wanted to strangle it at birth. These rationalizations don't hold up for a number of reasons. One is that most of the Palestinians were forced out of their homes before any Arab states ever became involved in the war. Arab states intervened on May 15th, 1948, but hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had already been forced from their homes prior to May 15th, 1948. But none of that really matters in terms of, the issue of rights. Because from a Palestinian perspective, it doesn't matter how you left if you're not allowed to return. There were Palestinians who were out of the country on business, who were studying abroad, who were sailors overseas, who were visiting family in other countries. And they suddenly became refugees, not allowed to return. You had major Palestinian cities like Jaffa, which were major regional cosmopolitan centers at the time, peers of Beirut, of Alexandria, that were just simply destroyed in terms of the Palestinian culture and economy and history, and that people became refugees and exiles to this day. So that's at the root of it. And in 1948, 90% of the Palestinian population in what became Israel left or were expelled, and about 10% at the time, 150,000 or so, remained behind. And today, that 10%, that 150,000, has grown to 1.5 million, roughly 1.5 million Palestinians living in what became Israel in 1948. Then in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, which was ruled by Jordan from 1948 to 67, and the Gaza Strip, which had been ruled by Egypt. So all of the Palestinians in historic Palestine came under the rule of the Israeli state. So as of today, you have 1.5 million Palestinians in Israel, another 1.6 million in Gaza, and about 2.5 million or so, 2.8 million in the West Bank. Along with them, you have about, as I mentioned, roughly 6 million Israeli Jews, just under 6 million, most of whom live in this area. Actually, most of them are concentrated around Tel Aviv and in the corridor up to Jerusalem. And you have another 500,000 or so living as colonial settlers in the West Bank since 1967. So you have actually, if you look at a more complicated map than this, if you were to go online and look up some of the maps and see where the towns and the cities are, you would see that you have a very intricately intermixed population that cannot easily be separated, and that is in many ways totally dependent on each other. Israeli settlers may hate Palestinians and consider them unworthy to live on the land, or that God didn't give them the land as the settlers believe He gave it to them. Palestinians may hate the settlers for stealing the land and taking it by force, as has certainly happened. But there is a certain level of interdependence, as the settlers rely to a large extent on Palestinian labor. Within Israel, you have large areas of mixed population, particularly in cities like Haifa and Akka, where Palestinians and Israelis live, if not exactly in the same neighborhoods, then in neighborhoods that are right up against each other. Gaza is totally segregated. It's fenced off, walled off from all sides, including from the sea, where there's a sea blockade on it, as many of you know. But so can we describe these conditions as apartheid conditions? Well, the essence of apartheid is when you have two groups of people living in the same territory, under the same government, but different rules or different sets of laws apply to them. And that is clearly the case in Palestine, Israel today. I mentioned Desmond Tutu, or I mentioned South Africa. I want to mention Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who, of course, was one of the most well-known figures in South Africa in the struggle against apartheid, was described as recently as last July in an article in the Charlotte Observer, the realities that he has witnessed in Palestine. I, for one, never tire of speaking out against these injustices because they remind me only too well of what we in South Africa experienced under the racist system of apartheid. I have witnessed firsthand the racially segregated roads and housing in occupied Palestinian territories. I've seen the humiliation of Palestinian men, women, and children at the checkpoints and roadblocks. I've met Palestinians who were evicted and replaced by Jewish Israeli settlers. Palestinians whose homes were destroyed, even as new Jewish-only homes were illegally built on confiscated Palestinian land. This oppression, these indignities, and the resulting anger are only too familiar. It is no wonder that so many South African leaders in the anti-apartheid struggle, including Nelson Mandela and numerous Jewish leaders, have found ourselves compelled to speak out on this issue. So that's Desmond Tutu's sense of the very physical and visible elements of this system of apartheid. That's now a reality of the system of